Captain Juno Kim walked through the busy halls of Kethra Station, feeling tired after another long week of space trading. His small cargo ship had just finished unloading rare metals from the asteroid belt, and his pockets were finally heavy with credits. The massive space station buzzed with life as hundreds of different alien species moved through the corridors buying and selling goods from across the galaxy. Juno had been doing this job for 15 years now and thought he had seen everything the universe could offer: the tall blue-skinned Altarians with their crystal voices, the small fuzzy Vortax who smelled like cinnamon, the mighty crag warriors with their 4 arms and booming laughs. But today something was different, something that made his stomach feel sick. As he walked past the food courts and equipment shops, he heard sounds that made him stop in his tracks. High-pitched screaming that sounded almost like human voices in pain. The sounds were coming from the livestock section of the market, where live animals were sold for food to different species across the galaxy. Juno had always avoided that section of the station. The smells were terrible, and watching creatures being sold for meat made him uncomfortable. But these screams were different. They sounded intelligent, they sounded scared, they sounded like they were begging for help against his better judgment. Juno followed the sounds through crowds of shoppers. His heart started beating faster as he got closer to the source. The screaming got louder and more desperate with each step he took. Other shoppers seemed to ignore the sounds, or maybe they were used to hearing such things in this part of the station. When he finally reached the livestock area, Juno saw rows and rows of metal cages filled with different creatures. Some he recognized as food animals from various worlds, but others looked strange and new. Then he saw the source of the screaming, and his world changed forever. In a group of cages near the back were creatures that looked like a mix between humans and cats. They stood on 2 legs, like people, but had soft fur covering their bodies and long tails that moved with emotion. Their faces were the most shocking part, though. They had large eyes that showed clear intelligence and expressions that were completely human in their fear and sadness. The creatures had small hands with fingers that gripped the cage bars as they pressed their faces against the metal. Their mouths opened in those terrible screams, but when they saw Juno looking at them, they went quiet. Their eyes met his, and he saw something that made his chest feel tight with emotion. These were not animals, these were people. A large slug-like alien trader noticed Juno staring at the caged beings. The trader slithered over with a wide smile showing rows of sharp teeth. His name tag said Vex, and he spoke in the common galactic language that most traders used. "Welcome, friend. Are you interested in some exotic meat? These are Falari from the Outer Rim, very rare and very delicious. The meat is tender and has a unique flavor that wealthy customers pay top credits for." Juno felt sick as he listened to the trader talk about these intelligent beings like they were cattle. The Falari in the cages seemed to understand what was being said because their eyes filled with more terror, and they pressed closer together, trying to protect each other. "How many do you have?" Juno asked, trying to keep his voice steady. 43 in total, Vex replied proudly. "This is actually the last shipment we will ever get. Their home planet was strip-mined for resources, and the species is now extinct in the wild. These are literally the final Falari in the entire universe, very collectible for that reason." Juno looked back at the cages and saw families huddled together, mothers holding small children, elderly ones trying to comfort the young, all of them knowing exactly what their fate would be. The largest female in the front cage looked directly at Juno with eyes that seemed to say, "Please help us. What do you want for one of them?" Juno asked. Vex laughed and shook his head. "Oh no, friend, I do not sell them individually. They are priced as breeding pairs or family groups. A single adult costs 50,000 credits. A breeding pair is 90,000. A family group with children is 120,000. Juno did quick math in his head. 50,000 credits each meant over 2 million credits for all 43 Falari. That was more money than most people saw in their entire lives. It was definitely more than he had even after his best trading year ever. As he stood there calculating costs, a group of wealthy-looking aliens approached the cages. They spoke loudly about which Falari would taste best and how they planned to cook them. Some wanted to buy just the children because they thought young meat would be more tender. Others argued about the best cooking methods for adult Falaritha Falari understood every word. The mothers pulled their babies closer, and the older ones stood in front of the young trying to protect them even though they were trapped in cages. The looks of pure terror on their faces made Juno feel sick to his stomach. One wealthy customer picked up a small Filari child through the cage bars, examining the crying baby like it was a piece of fruit at the market. The mother screamed and reached through the bars trying to get her child back. The customer laughed and made comments about how the small one would feed two people at most. Juno could not watch anymore. He turned away from the scene, feeling angry and helpless. These were intelligent beings with families and emotions, and they were being treated like livestock. Nobody else seemed to care that an entire sentient species was about to be eaten into extinction. As he walked away, he could still hear the Filari crying and calling out. The sounds followed him through the station corridors and into his mind, where he knew they would stay forever. He had seen many terrible things in space, but this was different. This was evil in its purest form. Back at his ship, Juno sat in his small cabin staring at his account balance on the computer screen. 2.1 million credits, the result of 15 years of dangerous work in the Outer Rim dodging pirates and barely making ends meet. It was enough to buy a bigger ship, hire a crew, and finally live comfortably, but all he could think about were those eyes looking at him through the cage bars, those intelligent, desperate eyes that seemed to understand he was their only hope for survival. Those 43 beings who represented the last of their entire species, facing death not in battle or from disease, but as food for creatures who saw them as nothing more than exotic meat. Juno knew he had to make a choice that would change his life forever. That night, Juno could not sleep at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those terrified Filari faces staring at him through the metal cage bars. He heard their desperate cries echoing in his mind and felt the weight of their hopeless situation pressing down on his chest like a heavy stone. His ship, the Soul Dream, felt smaller than usual as he paced back and forth in the tiny corridor between his cabin and the engine room. The walls seemed to close in on him as he thought about what he had witnessed in the livestock market earlier that day. He had been a simple trader worried about profit margins and fuel costs. Now he carried the knowledge that an entire intelligent species was about to be eaten into extinction around midnight. His childhood friend, Day, found him sitting in the pilot's seat staring out at the stars through the main viewport. She had been his engineer and only crew member for over 10 years and knew him better than anyone else in the galaxy. When she saw the look on his face, she knew something terrible had happened. "You look like you have seen a ghost," she said, settling into the co-pilot chair beside him. What happened on the station today? Juno told her everything about the Filari and the livestock market. He described their intelligent eyes and the way they held their children close when buyers examined them like pieces of meat. He explained how the trader Vex had bragged about selling the last members of an extinct species to wealthy customers who wanted exotic meals. Day listened in horrified silence as Juno painted the picture of what he had witnessed. Her own eyes filled with tears when he described the mother Filari desperately reaching for her baby through the cage bars. They had both grown up in the rough mining colonies where life was hard and death was common, but this was different. This was systematic cruelty on a scale neither of them had ever imagined. "How many of them are there?" she asked quietly. 43 total, Juno replied. "All families with children. The trader wants 50,000 credits each for them." Day did quick math in her head, and her face went pale. "That is over 2 million credits," she whispered. "That is everything we have saved in 15 years of trading." Juno nodded and pulled up his account balance on the main screen. 2.1 million credits exactly. It represented every dangerous job they had taken, every pirate attack they had survived, every sleepless night spent repairing the ship. In deep space, it was their future, their chance to finally buy a bigger vessel and hire a real crew. "We could get that new ship we always talked about," Day said softly. "The one with the luxury cabins and the advanced navigation system. We could stop taking those dangerous runs to the Outer Rim and start living like real traders instead of scavengers." But even as she said the words, they both knew what Juno was thinking. His hands clenched into fists as he stared at the credit balance on the screen. Every number represented months of hard work and sacrifice, but all he could think about was how many Filari lives each credit could save. "I keep thinking about their eyes," Juno said. His voice was barely above a whisper. They knew what was going to happen to them. They understood that people were buying them as food and there was nothing they could do to stop it. How can I sleep knowing that 43 intelligent beings are going to die because I wanted to keep my money day? Was quiet for a long time. She had known Juno since they were children working in the asteroid mines together. She remembered how he used to share his food rations with younger kids. Even when he was hungry himself, she had seen him risk his life. To save complete strangers more times than she could count, this decision was tearing him apart, but she already knew what he was going to do. If you buy them, what happens next? She asked. Where do we take them? Their home planet is gone and most of the galaxy thinks they are just animals. I do not know, Juno admitted. We would have to find them a new world, somewhere safe, a place where they could rebuild their society and raise their children without fear, but first we have to save them from becoming someone. Dinner. The ship computer chimed softly, indicating that the station market would open again in 6 hours. Juno knew that wealthy buyers would be arriving soon to purchase their exotic meals once the Filari were sold and shipped to different worlds. There would be no way to save them. You know, if we do this, we will be broke. Day said gently. We will lose everything we worked for and probably end up back in the mining colonies. Juno looked at his oldest friend and saw understanding in her eyes. Despite the enormous sacrifice, she was not trying to talk him out of it. She knew him well enough to realize that he could never live with himself if he walked away from those cages. I have to do it, he said firmly. I cannot let an entire species die when I have the power to save them, even if it costs us everything. Day reached over and squeezed his shoulder. Then we better get some sleep, she said. We have a big day tomorrow. As Juno finally drifted off to sleep a few hours before dawn, he dreamed of the Filari children playing safely in green forests under alien suns. He dreamed of mothers who no longer had to fear for their babies' lives and fathers who could teach their sons to hunt without worrying about becoming prey themselves. When he woke up, his mind was clear and his decision was final. He was going to spend every credit he owned to buy the freedom of 43 beings he had never met before yesterday, because it was the right thing to do, the only thing he could do, and still call himself human. Early the next morning, Juno walked back through the crowded corridors of HFY Station with his credit stick clutched tightly in his sweaty palm. The small device contained his entire life savings, 2.1 million credits earned through 15 years of dangerous trading runs in the Outer Rim territories. His heart pounded as he made his way to the livestock market. The sounds of alien voices haggling over prices filled the air, along with the smell of exotic foods and strange creatures. The normal bustle of commerce that had always excited him now made his stomach turn, because he knew what kind of merchandise was being sold here. When he reached the section where the Filari were kept, he saw that a crowd had already gathered. Several wealthy-looking aliens were examining the caged beings and discussing their plans for cooking them. A tall insect-like creature with jeweled wings was pointing at a young Filari mother and explaining to his companion how the stress hormones from fear made the meat more flavorful. The Filari themselves looked even more terrified than they had the day before. They had spent the night listening to potential buyers discuss their deaths in gruesome detail. The mothers held their children closer, while the older ones tried to comfort the young with soft humming sounds that reminded Juno painfully of human lullabies. Vex, the slug-like trader, was in his element, surrounded by interested customers and fielding questions about preparation methods and shipping arrangements. His slimy skin glistened under the market lights as he gestured toward the cages with obvious pride in his merchandise. My friend from yesterday," Vex called out when he spotted Juno approaching. "Have you decided to make a purchase? Perhaps a nice breeding pair for your personal collection?" Juno ignored the other customers and walked straight up to the trader. "I want to buy all of them," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the market area. The crowd went quiet and turned to stare at this human who had just made such an enormous offer. Vex blinked his multiple eyes in surprise, and his mouth opened and closed several times before he could speak. "All of them," he repeated. "You want to purchase the entire lot, every single Filari you have?" Juno confirmed, pulling out his credit stick. "The price is 50,000 each for 43 individuals. That comes to 2.15 million credits total." Several customers began protesting loudly. A crystal being with a musical voice complained that she had been planning to buy a family group for a dinner party, The insect creature buzzed angrily about humans interfering in legitimate business transactions, but Vex was already calculating profits in his head, and his greedy smile returned 2.15 million credits would be the largest single sale he had ever made, much better than selling the Filari individually over several days. Deal, he said quickly before any of the other customers could make counter offers. Let us complete the transaction immediately. Juno handed over his credit stick and watched as his life savings transferred into the trader account. Each digit that disappeared from his balance felt like a physical pain, but when he looked at the Filari in their cages, he saw something that made it all worthwhile. Hope, the largest female, who seemed to be their leader, was staring at him with wide eyes that showed the first glimmer of understanding that something different was happening. She whispered something in their own language to the others, and several of them pressed closer to the cage bars to get a better look at this strange human. The transaction completed faster than Juno had expected. Within minutes, he legally owned 43 sentient beings according to galactic law. They were his property to do with as he pleased, just like any other livestock purchase. The thought made him sick, but it was the only way to get them away from the meat market. Several of the disappointed customers lingered around, grumbling about the human who had bought all the exotic meat for himself. Some made crude jokes about what kind of feast he was planning, while others speculated about his motives. Vex began making arrangements for transport of the Filari to Juno's ship. The Soul Dream was not designed for passengers, but Juno had already asked Day to start converting their cargo holds into temporary living spaces. It would be cramped and uncomfortable, but it was better than the metal cages. As the paperwork was completed, Juno approached the Filari cages for the first time as their owner. The creatures watched him nervously, unsure what this change in ownership meant for their fate. They had learned not to trust any of the bipedal species that visited the market. "I'm going to get you out of here," Juno said softly, even though he was not sure they could understand galactic standard. "You are safe now." The leader female tilted her head at his gentle tone. Something about the way he spoke seemed different from the harsh voices of the traders and customers. She said something in their melodic language, and several of the others responded with what sounded like cautious hope. Loading 43 terrified beings onto his small cargo ship took most of the day. Day had worked frantically to create basic living spaces with sleeping areas, food distribution points, and waste facilities. The Filari were amazed to discover soft bedding instead of metal cage floors, and clean water instead of the dirty liquid they had been given at the market. As the last of the Filari was brought aboard, Juno checked his account balance one final time. 300 credits remained, barely enough fuel to reach the nearest inhabited system. Everything else was gone, spent on the lives of beings he had met only 2 days ago. But when he saw the Filari children exploring their new surroundings with wonder and heard the mothers humming gratefully to their babies, he knew he had made the right choice. He had traded his future for theirs, and somehow that felt like the best deal he had ever made. The Soul Dream had never carried so many passengers before, and certainly never passengers who were recovering from the trauma of being sold as livestock. Juno's ship was designed for cargo transport, not refugee rescue, and the challenges became obvious within hours of leaving Cathay Station. 43 Filari were crowded into converted cargo holds that they had hastily modified with basic life support systems. The spaces were cramped and uncomfortable, but compared to the metal cages they had been living in, they seemed like luxury accommodations to the grateful refugees. Many of the Filari refused to eat for the first several days. Their experiences in captivity had taught them to be suspicious of any food offered by bipedal species. Juno and Day had to demonstrate eating the same food themselves before the Filari would trust that it was not poisoned or drugged. The children were the most heartbreaking to watch. They clung to their mothers and cried constantly for family members who were already dead. The trauma of seeing their world destroyed and their people sold as meat had left deep scars on their young minds. Several of the adults seemed to have given up entirely and simply sat staring at the walls without responding to anything around them. Juno spent hours each day trying to communicate with them using simple gestures and basic words. The leader female, whose name he learned was Kira, seemed to understand that these humans were different from their Captors, she began teaching him words in the Filari language while learning basic galactic standard from him through painstaking communication. Juno learned about their destroyed homeworld. The Filari had lived in vast forest cities built high in the canopy of enormous trees. They were a peaceful people who valued art, music, and harmony with nature. Their technology was advanced but integrated seamlessly with their natural environment. Then, the mining corporation arrived. Surveys showed that their world contained rare minerals needed for starship construction. The corporate scientists declared the Filari non-sentient to avoid the legal complications of displacing a recognized intelligent species. Within 5 years, their entire forest civilization was stripped bare, and the few survivors were sold into the exotic food trade. The story filled Juno with rage and sadness, but also with determination. These were not just refugees, they were the last hope for an entire species. Every decision he made now would affect whether the Filari survived or joined the countless other species that had been destroyed by galactic expansion. As they traveled deeper into the Outer Rim territories, Juno faced practical problems he had not anticipated. The ship's food supplies were running dangerously low, feeding so many passengers, and he had only 300 credits left to his name. Day worked miracles keeping the life support systems running, but the equipment was being pushed far beyond its design limits. At a small trading post called Haven Station, Juno was forced to sell his personal belongings to buy more food and medical supplies. He sold his collection of rare artifacts, his spare clothing, and even his father's old trading license. Everything that connected him to his past life as a successful merchant went to keep the Filari alive. The station master, a gruff human named Park, looked at Juno's ragged appearance and the obvious desperation in his eyes. "What kind of cargo are you carrying that requires so many life support modifications?" he asked suspiciously. "Refugees," Juno replied simply, "people who needed help." Park did not ask any more questions. The Outer Rim was full of people running from something, and he had learned not to pry too deeply into other people's business, but he did offer Juno a piece of advice. "There is an unclaimed system about 2 weeks from here," he said quietly. "World called New Eden, in the star charts forest planet with breathable atmosphere and no sentient life, perfect for people who want to disappear." Juno thanked him and bought supplies with the last of his credits. As they prepared to leave Haven Station, Kira approached him with several other adult Filari. She had been learning galactic standard quickly and could now communicate in simple sentences. "Why you help us?" she asked, her large eyes filled with confusion. "We nothing to you. Why spend all money for strangers?" Juno thought for a moment about how to explain human morality to an alien species. "Because it was right," he said finally. "Because no one should die just for being different." Kira translated his words to the others, and several of them made soft sounds that Juno had learned indicated agreement or understanding. One of the older males stepped forward and spoke in their musical language. He says, "You give us tomorrow," Kira translated, "when have no tomorrow before. You give hope when have no hope." As the Soul Dream continued its journey toward the unclaimed system, Juno began to see changes in his passengers. The children started playing simple games instead of just crying. The adults began taking care of each other and organizing their limited space more efficiently. Most importantly, they started making plans for the future instead of just surviving each day. They noticed the changes too and remarked to Juno one evening that their passengers were transforming from victims into survivors. They still carried the scars of their trauma, but they were beginning to believe that they might actually have a chance at a new life. 2 weeks after leaving Haven Station, the Soul Dream finally reached the system that contained New Eden. The planet appeared on their screens as a blue-green marble covered with vast oceans and enormous continents of forest. When the Filari saw their new home for the first time, many of them wept with relief and joy. It was not their original world, and it never could be. But it was a place where they could be free. It was a place where their children could grow up without fear, and where they could rebuild their society according to their own values. It was the tomorrow that Juno had bought for them with everything he owned. The landing on New Eden was unlike anything Juno had ever experienced in his years of space travel. As the Soul Dream descended through the planet's atmosphere, the Filari pressed against every available viewport, crying and singing in their musical language. Many of them had not seen natural sky or breathed unfiltered air for over a year. When The ship finally touched down in a clearing beside a vast forest. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of 43 beings taking their first free breaths. The air was clean and sweet with the scent of growing things, and the gravity was only slightly lighter than their destroyed homeworld. Kira was the first to step outside, followed slowly by the other adults who carried the children in their arms the moment their feet touched real soil instead of metal. Decking, several of the Filari collapsed to their knees and pressed their faces to the ground. They had survived. They were free. They had a world of their own again. The children, who had been silent and frightened for so long, suddenly came alive with excitement. They ran through the grass laughing and calling to each other in their own language, while their parents watched with tears streaming down their faces. It was the first time Juno had seen them truly happy, but the celebration was short-lived. Reality set in quickly as they realized the enormous task ahead of them. They had no shelter except the ship, no tools except what Juno carried, and no supplies beyond. The emergency rations they had been living on the forest was beautiful, but it was also completely wild and potentially dangerous. Juno felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had spent everything he owned to bring these people to safety, but now how was he supposed to help them build a civilization from nothing when he barely had enough fuel left to reach the nearest inhabited? System Day saw the worry on his face and put a hand on his shoulder. "We will figure it out," she said quietly. "We always do." The Filari, however, surprised them both with their resilience and practical knowledge. Despite their trauma, they immediately began working together to assess their new environment. The adults organized themselves into groups while the older children helped care for the younger ones. Everyone had a job to do. Kira approached Juno with several other adults and began pointing toward different areas of the forest. She spoke in mixed galactic standard and Filari language, explaining what they were seeing. "Good trees for building," she said, pointing to a grove of straight-trunked giants. "Water sound from there." She gestured toward a distant area where they could hear running water. "Plants here smell like food plants from old home." Over the next few days, Juno watched in amazement as the Filari demonstrated skills he had never imagined. They showed him how to identify edible plants by their smell and taste, how to find fresh water by reading the landscape, and how to build temporary shelters using nothing but forest materials. The adults worked from dawn to dusk, creating a basic camp, while the children helped gather materials and keep watch for dangers. Within a week, they had constructed weatherproof shelters arranged around a central fire pit where they cooked meals and held evening discussions about their plans. Juno found himself learning alongside them as they rediscovered abilities their species had developed over thousands of years of forest living. They knew which trees provided the best materials for different purposes, how to weave strong ropes from plant fibers, and how to preserve food without technology. More importantly, they knew how to work together as a community. Every decision was discussed by the adults, while the children were included in age-appropriate tasks. The elderly ones shared knowledge, while the young adults provided physical labor. It was a functioning society rebuilding itself from nearly nothing. As the settlement grew, Juno realized that his ship was becoming less important to their survival. The Filari were creating something that would outlast any technology, a permanent home built in harmony with their environment. They still needed some outside resources, but they were well on their way to self-sufficiency. 3 months after landing, Kira approached Juno with news that filled him with wonder. "We count again," she said with obvious joy. "Some females carry new life." Juno stared at her for a moment before understanding hit him. Some of the Filari women were pregnant. Their species would not only survive but grow. The population would increase for the first time since their homeworld was destroyed that night around the central fire pit. The entire community celebrated the news of coming births. The children sang traditional songs their parents had taught them, while the adults made plans for expanding their settlement. They would need more shelter space, nursery areas, and increased food production. Sitting beside the fire, listening to their music and watching their faces glow with hope, Juno realized that his sacrifice had purchased something far more valuable than he had ever imagined. He had not just saved 43 lives. He had given an entire species a chance to continue existing in the universe. Day found him later staring up at the alien stars through the forest canopy. "Any regrets?" she asked quietly. "None." Juno replied without hesitation, "This is worth more than any ship or fortune we could have had." As if to emphasize his words, they heard the sound of Filari, children laughing somewhere in the darkness, playing games that their grandchildren would someday teach to their own young. The future was no longer a dream, it was becoming reality. 1 year after landing on New Eden, the Filari settlement had grown into something that amazed everyone who saw it. What had started as emergency shelters built from forest materials had evolved into a beautiful community that seemed to grow naturally. From the landscape itself, the Filari had built their homes in the trees, using techniques passed down through generations of forest dwellers. Rope bridges connected platforms at different levels, creating a three-dimensional village that moved gently. With the wind, smaller structures on the ground served as workshops, storage areas, and gathering places for the entire community. The population had grown from 43 to 62, with 7 healthy babies born during their first year of freedom. The pregnant mothers Kira had mentioned were only the beginning, as couples who had been too traumatized to think about the future began planning families in their safe new home. Juno had stayed to help establish trade relationships with passing merchants who were drawn to New Eden's unique resources. The forest produced rare medicinal plants, exotic spices, and beautiful hardwoods that were highly valued throughout the galaxy. The Filari's sustainable harvesting methods meant they could trade these resources without damaging their environment. More importantly, the planet contained deposits of the same rare minerals that had led to their homeworld's destruction, but unlike the corporate miners who had strip mined their original world, the Filari knew how to extract what they needed without destroying the ecosystem. Their traditional knowledge combined with careful planning allowed them to mine selectively while preserving the forest. The combination of forest products and carefully extracted minerals provided enough income to support the growing community and even allowed them to purchase technology that improved their quality of life. Solar collectors provided clean energy, water purification systems ensured safe drinking. Supplies and communication equipment kept them connected to the broader galaxy. But what impressed Juno most was how they had maintained their culture and values despite everything they had suffered. The children born on New Eden learned the same songs, stories, and traditions that had been passed down for thousands of years on their original homeworld. The trauma of genocide and slavery had not destroyed their identity as a people. News of the Filari rescue had spread throughout the galaxy, carried by traders and travelers who had heard the story of the human captain who spent his fortune to save an extinct species. The tale grew in the telling until Juno became a legendary figure known as the man who bought freedom for an entire race. Other refugees and displaced peoples began seeking out New Eden, hoping to find sanctuary on the world where impossible rescues came true. Juno found himself serving as an unofficial ambassador, helping worthy cases while screening out those who might bring trouble to the peaceful community. A family of scholars fleeing political persecution, a group of artists whose homeworld had banned creative expression, survivors of corporate wars who needed a place to heal and rebuild their lives. New Eden became known throughout the Outer Rim as a place where those who had lost everything could find hope again. The planet officially became known as Haven in the galactic databases and ships registry. The name spread quickly among those who needed to know about it while remaining obscure enough to avoid unwanted attention from authorities or corporations who might not approve of the sanctuary. Kira, who had learned to speak galactic standard fluently, now served as the elected leader of the Filari community. She often told the story of their rescue to visiting traders and refugees, always emphasizing the human who had chosen their lives over his fortune. "This is why we name our children after stars," she would say to the young ones born on New Eden, because sometimes the light comes from the most unexpected places. The Soul Dream had been refitted and expanded using profits from the planet's exports. The small cargo hauler that had once barely supported 2 people now served as a mobile embassy and rescue vessel. Juno and Day used it to patrol the Outer Rim territories looking for others who needed help. They rescued a group of child slaves from a mining operation, provided transport for political refugees fleeing persecution, delivered medical supplies to plague victims on forgotten worlds. The ship that had once carried only cargo now carried hope to the darkest corners of the galaxy. Each rescue mission was funded by the growing prosperity of New Eden. The Filari had developed a thriving economy based on sustainable resource extraction and careful trade. Relationships they never forgot that their freedom had been purchased with one man's life savings, and they were determined to pay that gift forward on the 5th anniversary of their rescue. The Filari held a celebration that brought visitors from across the galaxy. Traders brought news and goods while refugees shared stories of their own journeys to freedom. The festival lasted for 3 days, with music, dancing, and feasting that showcased the best of Filari culture. During the celebration, Juno found himself surrounded by Filari children who had been born on New Eden. They knew the story of their rescue by heart but loved hearing it again from the man who had made it possible. They asked endless questions about space travel and other worlds with the fearless curiosity of those who had never known slavery. One little girl named Stella, after the brightest star visible from their world, tugged on Juno's sleeve and asked the question that visitors often wondered about: do you ever wish you had kept your money and bought that big ship? Instead, Juno knelt down to her level and looked into eyes that sparkled with intelligence and joy. The same intelligence he had seen in cages 5 years ago, but now free to shine without fear. Every credit I spent buying your freedom was the best investment I ever made, he told her. You and your people are worth more than any ship in the galaxy. As the celebration continued around them, Juno reflected on how much his life had changed. He had lost his fortune but gained something far more valuable, a purpose that went beyond personal profit. His name had become legend among those who needed help, and his ship was welcome at ports where others feared to dock. The Soul Dream would continue its missions, carrying supplies to those in need and bringing refugees to safety. The galaxy was vast and full of suffering, but it was also full of people willing to help if someone would just show them the way. That night, as the festival wound down, Juno stood at the edge of the forest settlement looking up at the stars through the canopy. The Filari children were right to be named after stars, because in the darkness of space it was the lights that mattered most. He had learned that sometimes the most important choice a person could make was not what would benefit them but what would benefit others. Sometimes the greatest profit came not from keeping wealth but from spending it on something that truly mattered. Behind him he could hear the sounds of celebration continuing, the laughter of children who would grow up free, the songs of adults who had survived genocide and slavery, the plans being made by families who no longer had to fear for their futures. Juno smiled as he listened to the sounds of hope made manifest. He had traded his fortune for something priceless, the knowledge that one person really could make a difference in the universe. The Filari would survive and flourish. Their children would have children, and their story would be told for generations to come.